Hi everyone, we are back for the online class on KTV. Today we'll be dealing with computer applications, okay? This is the sixth subject generally, but this class is meant for ICSE 2020 and 2021. Why 2020? Because if you all remember, your exams are still due. So these classes will be in a way a revision for the ICSE 2020 students. And for ICSE 2021, well, you'll be learning it. Okay? So let's get going. Let's see what we have today. Okay, we are going to deal with the format of the ICSE paper, properties of Java, properties of OOP, basic structure of a Java program, tokens, and data types. I'll try to cover up all these topics. If not, obviously the next day we'll do it. First, you must remember that whenever you are preparing for any exam, you should know the format of the paper. What type of questions you are going to get, how many questions you are going to get, what are the marks that you are going to get for each and every program, each and every question, okay? So when we speak of computer application, it will be of 100 marks. That's the average. Why average? Because we have got two papers. We have got a project which is internal. Even this internal project is divided into two halves, 50 marks for internal, I can say that, or internal external. That is one teacher who teaches you the subject will be giving 50 marks, and some other computer teacher from your school will be giving you or marking you out of 50. So total 100 marks. And generally, hardly any student get less than 80 in this. But then we are not dealing with this, okay? This is internal, so let's not emphasize on this. We have got this written test, written exam. This is the exam which you will be sitting for, in which you will write the question, you will write the answers. This is again of 100 marks. Okay, so both 100, 100. Normally we say that 100, 100 will be added up and divided by 2 to get this average 100. But it is not that way, okay? This project will not be taken into consideration until unless you do this exam. Like suppose you get 100 out of 100 in this project. You already got 50 because 100 divided by 2 you got 50. That doesn't mean that you have already passed. Because if you don't sit for this exam, you will be marked absent. So this is more important than that. That will come into consideration only after you have given this one, right? So we'll emphasize on this written exam. Now this written test have two parts, section A and you got section B. Most of the 6 subjects have got these two sections, section A and section B. This section A is 40 marks and it's compulsory. There's no options. Whatever questions are there, you are expected to answer each and every one. Now when we speak of this section A, 40 marks, be to the point, precise answer is required. This is ICSE, short answers, to the point answer. Make sure that the keywords are present in your answer. Don't write extra. Because in this, okay, we'll deal with this later on. When we speak of this section A, generally you will have 3 questions. Question 1, question 2, question 3. For the last 2-3 years, we are getting only 3 questions. Earlier there used to be 4 questions. Now we are getting 3 questions. Each question will have subparts, like question 1 and question 2, excuse me, will most probably have 5 subparts. Each subpart will be of 2 marks each. 2 marks, not more, not less. So you are expected to write a very precise answer. For example, if you are asked, what is a switch case statement? Your answer should be, it is a type of selection statement. That's all. You get 2 points. No use writing a lengthy answer because you will not get more than 2 marks. What will happen is you will be wasting your time. The whole paper is of 2 hours. And section A, make it a point to finish it within 30 minutes. And you can finish it in 30 minutes if you are good at it. Okay? So try to finish this within 30 minutes by giving precise answer. In question number 3, there are 10 subparts, again 2 marks each. You might get here a small code which you might have to dry run. Dry run means you have to execute the paper, execute the question, execute the program, and visualize how the execution will take place and what will be the expected answer. So that is called dry running. You are supposed to dry run and give the output. But there also it will be 2 marks. So section A, 40 marks, compulsory. Try to spend only 30 minutes, not more than that. More important is this section B, which is of 60 marks. Excuse me, is of 60 marks. Here you got a choice. That is, you'll have 6 questions. But out of 6, you are expected to answer only 4. Out of 6, you are expected to answer 4. These 6 questions are all programs. All programs, because computer deals with programs. Okay? So 4 questions, each question will be of 15 marks. That means each program is of 15 marks. Now when you are writing the program, remember a program can be solved, a problem can be solved in more than one way. There can be a number of ways in which you can draw up the logic of solving a program. All are correct. As long as they will work on a machine, you get full 15 points. And also you must remember that after each question, you are supposed to write down the variable listing, a description of the variables, the data type of the variables, and why you have used those variables for. Okay? Spend more time on this, almost 1.5 hours, because these are programs. You might think you might start doing the program, and later on you might find that your logic is wrong, and you might have to redo it. So keep adequate time in your hand. Okay, for this reason I'm saying section A, spend 30 minutes, rest of it, spend it on section B. Okay, people say that computer is tough. Computer is not tough. If your fundamentals are clear, in fact, for any subject, if your fundamentals are correct, your basics are good, each and every subject is as easy as it can be. Okay? So this is your paper. So we continue from here, but you must remember, whether it is section A or section B or your project, these are all related to programming. So you should be good in programming. Now in class 10, ICSE and ISC, in fact, 10 and 12, we are dealing with the Java programming language. So what is Java? Java is a programming language. Most precisely, if we say, is a high-level, object-oriented programming language. We know that programming languages have got different levels. You got machine level, you got assembly level, and you got high level. All modern programming languages are high-level programming language. So Java is a high-level object-oriented programming language. Now, when you're doing Java, you should know the properties, because in section A, you generally tend to get questions related to the properties of Java and properties of OOPS. One common mistake that students make is they confuse between the properties of OOPS and the properties of Java. Make sure that when you're writing the answers, you're writing for the appropriate question, whether it is for Java or for the OOP. Okay? So when we speak of Java, these are some of the properties. If you're asked for the properties, you don't have to mention all of them. The most important ones you should answer. Like number 1, platform independent. Number 2, compiled and interpreted. Number 3, it is object oriented. Number 4, it implements multi-threading. 5, we have got distributed. 6, simple in comparison to other programming language. Robust, strong security, and portable. This last 4, simple, robust, strong security, and portable, are in relation to other programming language. But when we speak of this is very specific to the Java programming language. First one, platform independent. I briefly explained to you. Platform independent means once you write a program, that program, you can take it to any other machine, they will run. Any other system, a system is called a platform. The architecture of the computer, the operating system, the hardware part, they together form a platform. So when you develop a program in one particular platform, you can take it to some other platform and they will execute there also. So that's the meaning of platform independent. So Java is a platform independent programming language. Compiled and interpreted, this is mainly related to making it platform independent. Java programs are compiled. Most of you have done practical, so you know that after you write your practical, after you finish your coding, you are supposed to compile it. So when you compile a Java program, you get the bytecode. Bytecode is an in-between code. It is not directly the machine language. You must also remember that ultimately, whatever programming language you may be using, computer understands only the machine language, the low-level language. So once you write a program in Java, it needs to be converted to machine language. But it doesn't go in one direct step. It goes in two steps. So once you compile, a bytecode is created. This bytecode is platform independent. You can take it to any other computer. Those computers have got something that is called JVM, Java Virtual Machine. Java Virtual Machine. This is the one which will interpret this bytecode into machine level language. So you write the source code. It gets compiled to bytecode. Bytecode is interpreted by JVM to machine level language and executed. Okay? So this is how a Java program is translated from your source code to machine level language and executed. Then we have got object-oriented. All modern programming language implements object-oriented programming. That is, whatever we have, we make the program reflect real-life object. They behave like real-life object. Okay? Then we have got multi-threading, where more than one process can take place at the same time. Distributed, you can break up the program and develop them in different places, and later on they can be joined together to form a single unit. The rest, as I said, are related to other programming language. So this first 5, you can choose any of them if you are asked to mention a particular property of Java. You can choose any one of them. If you're asked to mention, you just mention it. You don't have to elaborate on it. If you're asked to define, then you write 2 lines of answer. You get 2 marks. Nothing more, nothing less. So these were the properties of Java. Now we move on to the properties of OOPS. Now what is object-oriented programming? It uses the concept of representing data and methods as object. Whether it is a data or a method, it will be reflected as an object. Any object. Okay? Whether you're talking about values, a value is represented as an object. If you're talking about a set of statements, they are also formed into an object. So each and everything inside an object-oriented programming is referred as an object. Now what are the basic properties of object-oriented programming? The 4 most important properties of object-oriented programming. Number 1, encapsulation. Number 2, data abstraction. Number 3, inheritance. And number 4, we have got polymorphism. Now what is inheritance? Or let's come back. Let's say, what is encapsulation? Well, see, right now we are under lockdown. We are staying at home. So what is happening actually? Why we are staying at home? We are staying at home so that we don't get infected by the corona. We don't come in touch with other people, or other people cannot come and interfere with you and give you the corona, or pass on the coronavirus to you. So we are being encapsulated by our house. We are staying, when we stay at home, we are staying safe. We are staying secure. So encapsulation provides the security, and the data and the information, the statements, the process, whatever you're writing inside an object remains safe and secure. So that is the property of encapsulation. Okay? Data abstraction. Now what does this mean? It means that when some information is passed from one object to another object, then the background details is not required. Like for example, suppose, say you want to go from Kalimpong to Siliguri. Okay? You book your ticket on the cab from the syndicate. Now, you go, you buy the ticket, you go, you take a seat, and you leave for Siliguri. You are not worried about the vehicle. What type of vehicle you have got, what is the model of the vehicle, what kind of tires are being used, whether it is running on petrol or whether it is running on diesel, you're not concerned. You're concerned only of reaching Siliguri from Kalimpong. So you are not dealing or you're not concerned with the background detail. Same way in the programming, if a method or an object is sending a value from one place to another place, then the receiving object is not worried about how that value has come. Suppose we have got an object A, which has got a value 5, which is sending to another object called B. So B is receiving this value 5. It is only concerned with this value 5. It is not concerned how this value 5 came, whether it was 4 plus 1, whether it was 2 plus 3, or whether it was minus 6 plus 1, or plus, let's say, 11. Whatever will be the method, this is not worried. B is not concerned with this. It only is worried or concerned with this value 5. So this is called data abstraction. Next, inheritance. As I said, object-oriented programming implements real-life object. So inheritance, think of biology. We all inherit something from our parents, from grandparents, and so on. Similarly, in case of object-oriented programming, if I have created an object or a class, say I've got a class A, I have created some properties. I have another class called B, which needs to use the same properties, these 3 properties that are there here. Class B also needs to do that. Now we can write these 3 properties again and some extra, or we can inherit from here. When you inherit properties, then you don't need to write these things again and again. So it saves time. I'm not going into the higher level of discussion about this. For your level, just remember, inheritance is the property by which one class gets the properties from another class. This is called the base class. This is called the child class. The one which inherits is called the child class. One which gives this property is called the base class or the parent class. Okay, so this is the property of inheritance. Polymorphism, same object existing in more form. This is also a type of biological term. Poly means many, morphism means of the same type. So many forms can be had. So you can have one object, say I've got a variable v. I can have another variable called v also, having different values. Of course, they will not be at the same place, they will be in a different place. So in a way, this will be a polymorphism. So these are the properties of object-oriented programming. So now you have a bit of idea about properties of object-oriented programming and properties of Java. So don't get confused with the properties of Java and object-oriented programming when you are asked in ICSE. We move on next. Okay, programming fundamentals. As I said, in computers, programming is the most important part. If you know programming, you can score a very high marks. You can score 100 out of 100 in computers also, because everything is related to the programming concept, and you should be very good in programming. Now, what is the basic fundamental of a program? Okay, here we have got a student. Now, what is this? Let's consider, for an example, let's consider a student, a school, class, and student. Now, each and every student cannot exist without a classroom or a school. Say 5 of you, okay, 5 students get together. You don't form a classroom, you don't form a school. You cannot say, okay, these 5 students, we are the school XYZ. You don't. For that, what you need is, you need to place these students inside a classroom. Like when you go to a school, a set of students go to class 10, a set of students goes to class 9, a set of students goes to class 8. You are having different classrooms. Okay, so when we have the students, they have to be in a classroom. But then having only the classroom is not enough. You create suppose you construct a classroom at your field, and 5 of your friends go inside that classroom. It doesn't become a school. For that, this classroom needs to be placed inside another compound, that's a school. So in a school, you got a number of classroom. Each classroom contains a number of students. Your school cannot exist without the school compound. Your school cannot exist without the classroom. Your school cannot exist without the students. Similarly, students cannot exist without the classroom or the school. The same concept can be used in programming. Instead of having the students, we have the executable statements. What are executable statements? Any statement that can be executed. Say, for example, I write A equals to 10. This is the statement. I write system dot out dot print A. This is a statement. So if I write only these lines and try to execute them, they will not work. So having only executable statements won't work. What I need to do is I need to place this inside a box or a block. In case of computer, this block will be called a method. Same as this one. You can see executable statements, same as students. Classroom, same as methods. So whatever executable statements you are writing have to be placed inside a method. Generally, you write public static void main. Then you write A equals to 10. Let's say int A equals to 10. System dot out dot print A. So these were the executable statements. These 2 lines, int A equals to 10, system dot out dot print A. These statements we have now placed within this method called main. This forms the block. Same as your classroom there. These are the students placed within the classroom. Now this classroom needs to be placed within the school. So in case of programming, this method needs to be placed within a class. So that's how it works. So before this, you create the class. So now this block forms the class. So whenever you're writing a program in Java, you have to create a class. You can give any name. Let's not write it A, say AB. We have to create a class. Within the class, we have to have at least one function or method. Within the function, you write your executable statements. So this is the basic structure of any Java program. You have to have a class, you have to have a function, and within the function comes the statements. Of course, you can have any number of class in your program. Each class can have any number of functions, and any function can have any number of statements. It will all depend on your program logic. Okay? So this is the basic structure of a Java program. So you got a class, you got a method, and you got executable statements. Now we will use this knowledge to write a simple program. Okay, we'll write a simple program to add 2 numbers. Let's assume the numbers to be, say, 15, and let's the second number be 27. This is just to see how the what is the basic structure of a Java program. Okay, that's all. Right. So this is a simple program. We have got something here with 2 forward slash where I've written simple program, PGM. Then comes the class. Here I'm creating the class. Okay, public class APGM1, that's the name of the program. First programming one. Then we have got public static void main, string args, int a equals to 15, b equals 27, c equals to a plus b. Then system.out.print /n, the sum equals to c. Okay, so this follows the pattern that we have learned just now. That is, we have got a class, we have created a function, and we have got a set of executable statements. So my executable statements are inside the main function. The function is inside the class. So it is following the basic structure of a Java program. Now, if you look at this program, I'll underline certain words. You see, first line, see, I've written something here. Then look at this one. Then there's something like here. Then we have got something this. We have got some more. Now you see, in a program, when we write a program, we are using a lot of different types of words and characters. So when you are doing a program, you need to use a certain words, certain characters to create the program. These are known as tokens. So tokens are the basic unit or the building block of a Java program. That means whatever I'm using in this program are a form of token. Now, depending on what function they are doing, we have got different types of tokens. The first one is known as the keywords. This, the one which I've underlined, not this one, the other one which I've underlined with red ink, these are called keywords. Keywords are also commonly called commands. They are basic things that you should know, keep in mind when you are using keywords. Number one, they have to be written in small letters. Keywords need to be written in small letters. You have to. If you don't use small letters, there are no more keywords. Like if you look at this public, small letters, class, small letters, static, small letters, void, small letter, int, small letters. All keywords have to be written in small letters. Also, you must remember the format, the syntax of keywords have to be correct. So these two things you have to keep in mind when you are using keywords. Next, we have got identifiers. Identifiers refers to the name. Each and every object has to be given a name. Like even in living world, each and every object has been given a name. Why you think we have given the name? Like I have got a name. What I'm holding in my hand, they have got name. Why we are using names? We are using names so that we can identify them. We can differentiate them from one object and the other object. See here, I've got a blue pen, red pen, and a black pen. So when I'm giving the names, I'm identifying them as a separate entity. Similarly, in programming, each and every object has to be given a name so that the compiler can differentiate one object from another one. So here we have got a class. The class has been given the name FPGM1. This is the name. This is the identifier. Main itself is the name. A, B, C. These are also names of variables, names of objects. So each and every object has to be given a name. This is called an identifier. When you are using identifier, you have to follow certain rules. Similarly, like when we have names, when humans are given name, when you were given name by your parents or your grandparents, certain rule was followed. Similarly here, we need to follow certain rules for identifiers. Rule number 1, you cannot use the keywords. Keywords cannot be used as identifiers. Keywords are commands, they are reserved words, so they cannot be used for any other purpose. So keywords cannot be used as identifiers. Identifiers, the name that you give generally should not have any blank space because it should be one word. Like you may have something like say total marks. I'm using two different words, but there's no space, so it makes one single word. The moment you will give a space, it will become two words. Say for example, it becomes, there's a space here, so it becomes two different words. So this is not allowed, so no space. Next, you must remember that no special characters can be used except for the $ and the underscore. No special characters allowed except for $ and the underscore, because all other special characters have got some other task associated with them. Okay? And one more important thing, you should not start with a number. You should not start with a digit. Like I cannot have this name total marks as say 3 total marks. I cannot start with a digit. But I can write this somewhere else. I can write here. Instead of this 3, I can write here total marks 3. This becomes valid. Okay? So these are some of the points that you must keep in mind when you're using identifiers. Then we have got literals. They refer to these values. 15, 27, the sum is a remark. Any value that you use in your program is called a literal. Literals need to be stored. Generally, literals are stored in variables like A, B, and C are variables. What are variables? Variables are memory space where the values are stored. You can sometimes refer to literals as constants also. Okay. Next, we have got operators. Operators are special characters that perform a specific task on one or more operand. Okay. So here, this equals to is an operator. The plus sign we have used is an operator. So in a program, you will be using a number of different types of operators. Then we have got punctuators and separators. Like if you look at the end of each executable line, I have given a semicolon. Okay, so this comes under punctuators and separators. I have used this curly brackets. Here, and one more was there. The curly brackets. These are all punctuators and separators. And then we have got comments. This first line is a single line comment. Comments are non-executable. They are meant to give a remark to a particular code, part of the code. Mainly it is for the benefit of the programmer, not for the user, because it is non-executable. So these are the tokens of a Java program. You will be using most of this when you are writing a program. When you develop a program, you will be using these tokens. Okay? So from now on, any program that you do, remember, you will be using these tokens. Okay, we will stop here because I think once we start, there's no end to it. So we'll continue with the rest of it in the next class, that is the next day, that is tomorrow. Okay? So till next day, stay safe, stay at home. See you next day. Thank you.
A wise man once said, if only history could be taught in the form of stories, it would never be forgotten. Hello, children, and welcome to ICSE online video lectures. I am Ms. Bidya, and I've come especially today to help and guide you in learning history. Before coming, I was a bit apprehensive about the chapters that I should select or the topics that I should choose for today's lecture. But after doing a bit of my homework, I consulted a few students, got their feedback, and also answered some of their queries, and I have come to a conclusion that I will have to start from the very first chapter itself. Let me make myself clear about few things. My video lectures will be entirely based on the parameters and the guidelines set by the Council for the examination 2021. What do I mean by parameters and guidelines set by the Council? As you all are aware of, the Council publishes its regulation and syllabus handbook every year. So if you just check the syllabus for your history, then it will be quite clear to you exactly what topics you have to study. For instance, when I'm referring to the First War of Indian Independence, I have my syllabus handy right in front of me. So let me just read out. The syllabus says that you are expected to study only the causes which are political, socio-religious, economic, and military, and consequences will be tested. It is very, very clearly mentioned the factors and the consequences will be tested. The events, however, need to be mentioned in order because we have to go as per the sequence and continuity for a more comprehensive understanding. So if you just flip back or revise the previous 10 years questions, then you will realize that there is not a single question on the spread of the revolt. So therefore, in all probability, or as has been said by the Council, we only need to stress on the factors and the consequences. Secondly, my video lectures are not only for explanation, it is also to help you in writing better answers, and I will come to that later. Thirdly, I expect all the students to be absolutely clear about this syllabus. Today it's very easy. If you just flip through the first few pages of your textbook, the syllabus for the year is already mentioned. Or you can get a copy of the regulation and syllabus handbook in any of the bookstores. Or if you do not have these two things, then at the end of the video lecture, I will recommend the website from where you can download so. Now, teaching history is really challenging, especially when you have to face queries like, there are lots of queries, endless queries like, why do we have to study this boring subject? Why do we have to study about people who are already dead and gone? How do we memorize the various dates and years which are mentioned? I cannot remember the names of countries or kings or rulers or alliances, etc. You have a number of problems. But for all your problems, we also have solutions. And that is why I have come specially here today to offer you the solutions. Just like maths has formula to solve your problems, even in history, you can come up with your own formulas. You can devise your own tools and techniques to learn the lesson better. And I would like to share with you few tips on how to understand the subject better. For example, I always follow the technique of mind mapping. What is mind mapping? I know I spoke about a query earlier where I said most of the children say, how do I memorize? So here are some of the tools that I will be sharing with you today. First and foremost, you can make use of charts. Now, charts are nothing but more of cutouts and pictures that you paste, and you all please remember that in the long answer section, sometimes you do get a picture study. You might get a picture of Tilak, you might get a picture of Adolf Hitler, you might get a picture of Gandhiji, and you will have to answer them. So charts will become helpful, especially in answering your picture study questions. Secondly, I come to maps. Maps in history? I thought maps was only in geography. No, you will have to use maps, especially when you study revolutions, when you study world wars, because personally, I have faced a lot of problem while teaching the world wars. Children have no idea, no clue about the countries, especially which are involved in the war, continents which are involved in the war, and also regarding the strategic locations of the countries and the proximity of one country to the other. So I would recommend all students, you do not have to look for a map here and there. Maps are there in your textbook. Especially when we are dealing with Indian history, you have maps here. When I'm going to explain to you the first war of Indian independence, especially while dealing with the topic spread of the revolution, I will be using this map. And especially while dealing with the two world wars, I will have to use the world map. Thirdly, we come to tables. Tables are essential for comparison because normally you are trying to find out the similarities and dissimilarities between personalities, between ideas, etc. Like in Indian history, you are asked to compare, take out the similarities between Gandhi and Tilak. You have to find out the dissimilarity, between Gandhiji and Subhash Chandra Bose. In contemporary history, when we study about Hitler and Mussolini, that time we have to understand, we have to find out the similarities and dissimilarities between the ideas of Nazism and fascism. And again, in civics also, it is going to be helpful, especially when you are comparing the powers and functions of Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, or it could be the powers and functions of High Court and also the Supreme Court. So if you have already done a tabular study, it's going to be helpful for your examinations. Next, we come to timeline. What is a timeline? I always refer to timeline as the fishbone structure. Timeline is nothing but a periodic division of events that have taken place in certain years. Like if I have to show you the timeline for the national movement, I would begin with 1757, the famous Battle of Plassey or Plassey as it is pronounced. Then I would come to maybe 1857, that was the first war of Indian independence. And then I would conclude with 1947, the year we got our independence. So, like I was saying, the query, how do I remember or memorize the dates and years? Here it is, children, right in front of you, through the method of timeline. You will remember not only the years, but also the events that took place. Now, when I was referring to the charts and maps and tables and timelines, this was basically to understand the chapter, to memorize, to learn. But ultimately, you have to write it down in your examinations. So what is going to come handy? The usage of keywords. Keywords are that one single word, the word that says it all. For example, if I have to take the question, what is the composition of Security Council? The keyword actually, it's 15 members. That's it. So therefore, the keyword not only helps you to write your answers better, but it is also helpful from an examiner's point of view because it will ease their task of correction. So it is both ways. It will help you write better. It will help the other set of teachers correct the answers in a better manner. Analyzing this year, that is 2020's question paper, you will find out that there is not a single objective question from the chapter First War of Indian Independence. Objective sections are compulsory. Each question carries 2 marks, but sadly, there was no objective question in 2020. However, in 2020, from the section B, that is the long answer section, where you are supposed to choose 3 questions out of 5, here you had a solid 10-mark question from the First War of Indian Independence. So, if only you would have prepared the chapter properly, your lessons properly, you could have easily scored a 6er. So, in all probability, when we are going to deal with the First War of Indian Independence, we will learn the chapter or we will memorize or we are going to by heart all the objective questions from this particular chapter. So, let's kickstart today's session with the First War of Indian Independence. This First War of Indian Independence is also known by many other names. Some historians refer to it as the Revolt of 1857, Rebellion of 1857, the Mutiny of 1857, or most commonly, the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857. If 1857 remains common, the words like mutiny, rebellion, revolution, revolt, what is the meaning of all these terms? When a section of people are unhappy, they are dissatisfied, they are frustrated with the existing system, they do not like the present condition, the present social order, the first thing that they will do is voice out. They will protest. And the same thing happened in India also. Who protested against whom? Here we had a section of the Indians protesting against the British rule in India. And thus started the historic revolution of 1857. Let us go through the objectives of this lesson. Why we need to study the historic revolution of 1857. Because we need to understand the causes of the revolt. We need to understand the major developments that took place during this phase. And also, we need to assess the impact, the kind of result, the kind of consequence that this revolution had on the British as well as on the Indians. Now, in my chapter, I will be covering the timeline, the causes, the spread, and the failures. Like I said, when you have to study, please use the tool of also dividing the various topics. The timeline of the revolution. Just like any other sciences, history also involves the cause and effect theory. There has to be something which causes that particular event. Here, the cause is 1857 Sepoy Mutiny. But if you go backwards, we need to analyze the causes, the factors which prompted this revolution. 1857, if you go exactly 100 years back, a very famous battle took place between the British and the Nawab of Bengal, that is Siraj-ud-Dawla, which is known as the Battle of Plassey. From this historic battle, the result was the Nawab was totally defeated. And ever since, the British supremacy, the British power in India was grounded. In 1848, Lord Dalhousie, we will come to Lord Dalhousie later, he was a Governor General and he came to India. 1853 was another landmark event. Why? Because introduction of railways and telegraphs. For the first time, modern means of transport and communication was introduced in India in the year 1853. Then, because of all this, we had the Sepoy Mutiny. Then, we also need to go after what happened after. So, in 1858, the revolution was lost by the Indians. This very same year, Queen Victoria made her proclamation. And in 1876, Queen Victoria assumed the title of Empress of India. So I think the timeline will help you. Now we come to the main part, political causes of the revolution. I would recommend children to please draw a pyramid. It's very easy to draw a pyramid, just a triangle, which represents the Indian society. On the topmost corner, we have the ruling class. By ruling class, I'm referring to the Rajas, the Maharajas, the Nawabs, the Nizams, the Begums of India, of various kingdoms, sorry. The second class was the landed aristocracy, or in Hindi, we like to call them as the Zamindars. The third section was the religious leaders, all your Maulvis and all your Brahmins. And last but not the least, at the base, you had your laborers, you had your peasants, you had your people who were engaged in handicrafts, and also you had your artisans. So this entire pyramid represents the Indian society. The political causes, it affected the ruling class, the topmost, the peak that you can see here. And while referring to the political causes, the first cause that I'm going to talk about is the subsidiary alliance policy. What is an alliance? Alliance is just a partnership. So there is a give and take relationship. This was introduced by Lord Wellesley. It was an agreement made by the British with the native rulers, the kingdoms, wherein the British would provide protection services to the Indian rulers, but not for free. Remember, children, it's not for free. In exchange, they had to make a payment. So nothing is free. Give and take. The British will give protection services. The Indian Rajas, Maharajas, Nawabs, and Nizams will have to make the payment. But where is the problem? Everything is fair and square. The problem was that if any ruler failed to make a payment, this resulted in the annexation of the kingdom. Now, who does this? The British trading companies, they had come here to do business. But now they had, I think, moved an inch further and had started annexing the kingdom. And this is where the rulers had a problem. The second one is the famous doctrine of lapse. We need to concentrate on the doctrine of lapse because it is a very frequently repeated objective question. Comes for 2 marks, also comes as 2-part question. What is the doctrine of lapse? Question mark. Who introduced it? And the marking scheme normally is 1 + 1. So let's look at the doctrine of lapse. Introduced by Lord Dalhousie. Now the timeline will come handy here because we have already seen that Dalhousie came to India in 1848 as the Governor General. What does this doctrine of lapse say? It stated that if any ruler died without its natural heir, its biological children, then the adopted heir. Now in India, we have a system. Not all parents are lucky enough to have children, so the next alternative is adoption. But here the British have a problem with adoption. They are saying the heir cannot inherit the title or the kingdom and the state would be annexed to the British Empire. This was absolutely against the laws, against the customs. The rulers were very upset. Especially, we can see a number of kingdoms who became victims of this particular doctrine. For example, Satara, Jhansi, I think this rings a bell, the Rani of Jhansi, Nagpur, Sambalpur, they all became victims of this doctrine of lapse. The next one was annexation of Oudh. Now you will find 2 spellings of Oudh in most of the textbook. One is A-W-A-D-H Awadh or O-U-D-H Awadh. It practically means the same thing. What happened in Oudh? In 1856, the British annexed Awadh. Remember, children, this is again another frequently repeated objective question. They ask, why was Awadh annexed? Now, on the pretext of misrule, let us use again this tool of keyword. what the examiners are looking for is the word pretext of alleged misrule. That is it. Who was the Nawab? Nawab Wajid Ali Shah. He was not only dethroned, he had to leave his palace, he had to leave his throne. He was exiled and sent somewhere to Calcutta. And this not only hurt the sentiments of the rulers and his families, but it was really bad, especially for the majority of Indian sepoys who were working in the British forces and who belonged to Awadh. They could not hear, especially when they heard that how their Nawab has been treated, they were very upset and angry with the British. The next one, is disrespect shown to Bahadur Shah Zafar. Children, in your previous classes, you all have studied about the famous Mughal Empire and their emperors. We cannot thank the emperors for their contribution to India. To name a few, we have Akbar and Shah Jahan. I'm not telling the names in chronological order. Akbar and Shah Jahan and Humayun and Babur and all that, they have left great legacy behind. Here we are talking about one such Mughal emperor called Bahadur Shah Zafar. In 1849, just exactly 1 year after he came to India, Lord Dalhousie announced, now he is ordering, Bahadur Shah Zafar, that his sons will not be allowed to stay in the Red Fort. It's okay, but when does he announce this? Before the death of Bahadur Shah Zafar. An emperor has not even passed away. And we have a British coming and telling you that your sons will not be allowed to use the Red Fort as your palace. You will be moved somewhere to Qutub Minar. You will have to stay there after your father passes away. Next, in 1856, Lord Canning came. What does he have to say? He says again to Bahadur Shah Zafar that after your death, again another, I think, a stroke that Bahadur Shah Zafar might have suffered from, that his sons will not be allowed to use the title of an emperor. The legacy of that title has been passed from generation to generation, and we have a person coming from outside and ordering the emperor that your sons will not be allowed to use the title. This angered, again, the ruling class, as well as the common Muslims who considered the emperor as a symbol of their power and grandeur. Next, disrespect to Nana Sahib. Bollywood movies, normally, if you have watched, we have a lot of movies on the Maratha emperors, etc., especially on Bajirao. I think that was quite a recent movie. Nana Sahib was the adopted son of Peshwa Bajirao II. I would recommend children to please watch the movie, not for the story, in fact, but just to show, just to understand more about the society in those days. So he was the adopted son. So again, let's come back to doctrine of lapse. Very sorry, he's not the natural heir. So being an adopted son, he cannot inherit his father's property. After his father's death, he was not granted pension. The British refused to regard him as a successor to the Peshwa throne. So what is the next step? Nana Sahib got furious. He appealed to the masses. He asked for their help to rise up against the British atrocities. So we have covered the political causes. Let's recap again. We have disrespect to Nana Sahib, the disrespect shown to Bahadur Shah Zafar. We have the doctrine of lapse, the annexation of Awadh, and the subsidiary alliance policy. Now let us come to the economic causes. Economic referring to the finance, to money, etc. And the first factor that we need to analyze is the drain of wealth. The drain of wealth, especially the entire theory about the drain of wealth, was written by Dadabhai Naoroji, explained very properly in his book, Poverty and Un-British Rule in India. So what is the drain of wealth? As you all know, the British came as traders here. They wanted to make profit, they wanted to make money. When the Industrial Revolution broke out in Europe you had technology, you had ideas, you had machines, you had laborers, but you did not have raw materials. So this quest, this search for raw materials brought most of these European trading companies to the continents of Asia and Africa. What could they pick up from here? They could take anything, name it, spices, your jute, your cotton, rubber, silk, tea, coffee, where they could ship it back to Europe, sell it to the European markets at a very high price. Naturally, they're here to make profit. But not only that, some of them also, they converted it into finished goods, brought it back to the same markets, and sold it at a higher price. So, drain of wealth is where raw materials were purchased at a cheap rate, but the finished goods that were brought from Europe were sold at a high price. So, what was the result of this? Many countries like India turned into colonial markets. So, like I said, it has been explained very properly by Dadabhai Naoroji. Now, this economic cause, which I'm referring to, the drain of wealth, had a kind of chain effect, because if you see here, the drain of wealth also resulted in the closure of Indian small-scale and handicraft industries. Now, let's come back to the pyramid. If the political causes hurt the sentiments of the ruling class, here the economic causes started affecting this base. Many of the laborers became unemployed. The peasants also suffered. The people who were craftsmen and artisans, they suffered. Why? Because of the closure of small-scale and handicraft industries. So another thing that is related to this is, naturally, it led to mass unemployment. Mass unemployment means, again, poverty. And you will be shocked to know that between 1837 to 1838, India suffered from famines and starvation. This resulted in the loss of thousands of lives, just like what is happening right now. Every day in the news, we see that the number is just going up. So the same thing happened in between 1837 and 1838. Now, next we come to the socio-religious causes. When I have to describe the Indian society, we are a very traditional society. We believe in keeping up with the traditions. We believe in following our customs. And not only following, we also believe in passing our customs from one generation to the other. Now, the socio-religious causes tell us it will highlight some of the, social evils that existed in the society at that point of time. If you look at it from the Indian society point of view, it is a custom. It is a tradition. You have to follow. But if you look at it from a European point of view, then it was a social evil. So let us discuss some of the prevalent customs that were existing during those years. Sati system, Parda system, child marriage, female infanticide, dowry system. I can go on and on, but let me stop here. So first, we will discuss the interference with social customs, especially in reference to the sati system. Now, what is a sati system? Amongst the Hindus, there was a system of a wife jumping to the funeral pyre of a husband, especially after his death. So, in this way, she was regarded as a sati. So this custom was very prevalent. As soon as the husband died, the wife had to get ready because she had to jump to the funeral pyre. When the British came here, they got a culture shock because they saw only the wives were jumping into the funeral pyre, the husbands never did. So they wanted to reform, they wanted to change the Indian society. And as a well-wisher, as somebody who wants to help the women, they abolished the sati system. From now on, no one will die as a sati. I think for many of us, it's a very good step, but for the religious leaders. Now again, let's come to the pyramid. In the religious leaders, we are referring to the caste Brahmins. They were absolutely annoyed with this abolition of the sati system. They felt that this is some kind of interference which will not be tolerated. Next is Widow Remarriage Act. A widow, plain and simple, after a husband dies, a woman turns into a widow. Like I said earlier, child marriage was very prevalent. People married at a very early age. Medical facilities were not so advanced. The mortality rate was very, very high. Malaria and starvation and famines were always there in India. So you can just roughly calculate for yourself. If a girl gets married at the age of 12, and by the age of 15, if she becomes a widow, then she had to leave her house and join the widow ashram. And life in widow ashram was miserable. We have often seen she was not allowed to meet any outsider. She had to wear all plain clothes, cannot indulge in any of the worldly pleasures, etc. So life was very horrible for them. Again, the British became emotional. They again wanted to help the Indian women. So they introduced Widow Remarriage Act, a second chance for the widows if you want to get remarried. But what happened? Again, the Brahmins were upset. They felt that it is written in their scriptures, in the ancient scriptures, no widow can get married. It was against their religion. The third one was even worse. Western education to girls. Girls never went to school. They were never given education. They're only fit to be in the kitchen or they have to get married. That's it. But now, Western education to the girls was almost like dropping bombs on them. So therefore, here again coming back to the pyramid, it hurt the Hindu society, especially the sentiments of the Brahmins. This is epic. Introduction of railways and telegraphs. Let's again go back to the timeline. I have told you earlier, in 1853, it was a very historic landmark. Railways and telegraphs were introduced in India, not for the benefit of the Indians. This was purely for the benefit of for the British, because they had to transport raw materials. They had to move from one place to the other, so they would make help of railways and telegraphs. So imagine when the railway tracks were being laid and the work was in progress. So inquisitive Indians who were quite backward at that point of time, illiterate, never seen a railway, they had lots of questions coming in their mind. So when being asked to explain what is a railway, somebody must have told them it is nothing but a box on wheels, it moves on tracks, it has benches, everybody sits together, everybody travels together. This was again another bomb for the Brahmins. Why are they against the railways? They are against the railways because they felt it is going to defile their caste. Not at all. In no way we are going to sit side by side with the other caste and we are going to lose it. So it's very funny at times also, but then this was how the Brahmins reacted to the railways. But telegraph poles is even more interesting because you can see the word rumors. We Indians are famous with rumors. We love spreading rumors and we love hearing rumors as well. But I think in the present condition, we have a new word which has been coined for the rumors. It's infodemic. We all are victims of fake news. And we love sharing them, we love forwarding them, and we love reading them also. Similarly here, the rumors spread now that the telegraph poles which are being brought to the villages have been brought to hang people. God save them, has been brought to hang people. So they were so scared that they would not allow the telegraph poles to be erected in their places. And this is why, again, we go back to that section, the last base over there, they were not very happy with the introduction of railways and telegraphs. Next is taxation of religious places. British are here to earn money in this way or that way. So the British began to tax the religious places of worship. Temples, mosques, they started collecting money. Growth of missionary activities. When the missionary people came to most of the villages, when they visited the interiors of India, Indians became suspicious. They were not liking it at all. The reason is because they felt that the missionaries are going to start school, they will start off with Western education, and if we are going to send our children to these schools, there is a fear of conversion. So our religion will also go, our customs have already gone, our traditions have already gone, now it is the turn for religion. That is why they wanted to protest against the British. Now we come to the military causes, and I'm going to wrap up with this. The next factors, I will deal with it in the next session. In the military causes, we have ill treatment of Indian soldiers. They were given low salary, low allowances, housing facilities were really miserable in comparison to the Europeans. They also had bleak chances of promotion. No matter how much you fight for the British, whether you lose your arm or you come back dead or alive, you had bleak chances of promotion. The highest rank that an Indian could ever get was that of a Subedar. You couldn't go above that. So naturally, that turmoil, that dissatisfaction was also there among the soldiers. General Service Enlistment Act, this comes as a 2-mark question. It comes in the objective section. I think in 2019 also, this question had come. General Service Enlistment Act was passed in 1856, exactly a year before the revolution. It says that Indian soldiers could be sent overseas on duty. What a joyous news. You can be sent overseas. You can go and work outside. For many of us, it's fun. We'll go and work outside. Again, where's the problem? The problem was when the Brahmin soldiers, for the Brahmin soldiers, it was a taboo. This is the key word. If in your objective question you have what was the General Service Enlistment Act, you have to explain the act, and you also have to write that it was a taboo, a strict no, prohibition to cross seas and ocean, as this would result in the loss of their caste status. So they were not happy to travel abroad because they felt that they would lose their caste status. Faulty distribution of troops. Faulty meaning something is not correct, something is not right. Something was not right for the British, but everything was right for the Indians here. The number of Indian sepoys which are supposed to be there, for us, I told you it was an added advantage because it exceeded the British soldiers. Initially, we did not realize this distribution. But once the Indian sepoys, they came to know, they were aware that we are much more in number than the British, suddenly the courage came. Strategic places like Delhi and Allahabad had no British forces. How good is that? Because in Delhi we have Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar and there are no British troops. You are unhappy with the British. This is the right time to strike. Britain was engaged in several wars and battles in and outside India. So if you have to strike, this is the right time. And I will conclude today's lecture with the immediate cause of the revolt. The immediate cause of the revolt was the introduction of the Enfield rifle. This chapter will also show, or it will also tell you, the advancement of weapons which took place as time passed by. Because here we are referring to a new weapon which has come. It is just introduced by the name of Enfield rifle. I presume everybody must have seen a rifle, and if you have not, we have more sophisticated weapons right now, but if you have not, then you can go back and check the net. In 1856, the British decided to replace the musket. The musket is almost like a pistol, but it is pretty long. They wanted to replace that and use a new weapon, which is the Enfield rifle. Where was the problem? This is happy news, good news. You're using now a more sophisticated weapon. The problem was the loading process of the rifle. When you were loading the musket, it was very easy. You just need to load the cartridge and fire. Simple. But the loading process of this particular rifle was very different. You had to bite the top greased paper. Greased meaning it is oily. You had to bite it off, you had to load it, and you have to fire. So there is an added, I think, work here, a task here, and that is to bite off the greased paper. Again, where's the problem? The problem is rumors now started spreading in Bengal that these cartridges, greased cartridges, is greased. Greased with what? Not with butter. Greased with the fat of either cow or pig. This is the beauty of rumor. You do not know what exactly it is, so either cow or pig. And what was the effect or chain reaction of this? Cow was considered a holy animal by the Hindus, whereas for the Muslims, the pig was a taboo. With this suspense, I would like to end today's session. I will continue with the rest of the session in the next class. Till then, stay safe, save lives, and stay indoors. Thank you.
दशौं श्रेणीका सम्पूर्ण नेपाली लिने विद्यार्थीहरूलाई हार्दिक शुभेच्छा अनि शुभकामना व्यक्त गर्दछु। यो अनलाइन शिक्षा मार्फत घर बसेरै यो नेपाली विषयमा अनि अन्य विषयमा पनि क्लास लिइरहेका, शिक्षा हासिल गरिरहेका विद्यार्थीहरूलाई हार्दिक स्वागत अभिवादन जनाउँदै म नेपाली विषय दशौं श्रेणीका पाठ्यक्रम अन्तर्गत नेपाली विषयमा आज केही कुराहरू जानकारी गराउन लागिरहेको छु। सर्वप्रथम नेपाली विषय आइसिएससीमा नेपाली विषयको कुरा गर्नुपर्दाखेरि हामी पहिला पाठ्यक्रम बारेमा अलिकति छोटो चर्चा गर्नेछौँ र पाठ्यक्रम बारेमा चर्चा गर्दाखेरि दशौं श्रेणीको परीक्षामा अथवा आइसिएससी परीक्षामा नेपाली विषयमा 80 अङ्कको परीक्षा बोर्डमा दिने गरिन्छ, जसमा 20 अङ्कको कार्यपत्र अथवा प्रोजेक्ट जो स्कुलकै टिचरहरूद्वारा सम्बन्धित विषय शिक्षकहरूद्वारा 20 अङ्कको प्रोजेक्ट दिइन्छ, जुन प्रोजेक्ट को एक्सटर्नल अनि इन्टर्नल इक्जामिनरले अङ्क पठाउने व्यवस्था गरिन्छ। अनि 80 अङ्क जुन रहन्छ, 80 अङ्कको परीक्षा दिइन्छ, जो लिखित परीक्षा हुन्छ र 80 अङ्कको परीक्षामा विशेष गरेर सेक्सन ए अनि सेक्सन बी गरेर खण्ड क अनि खण्ड ख गरेर दुई खण्डमा विभाजन गरिन्छ। ग्रामर अनि लिटरेचर, साहित्य अनि भाषा दुईटा अलग अलग खण्ड गरेर प्रश्नपत्र दिने गरिन्छ र त्यसमा विशेष गरेर सेक्सन ए अथवा खण्ड कमा पहिलो प्रश्न निबन्ध लेखन हुने गर्छ र निबन्ध लेखनमा कमसेकम 5 वटा अथवा 6 वटा विषय, विभिन्न समसामयिक विषयहरू दिइन्छ, जुन विषयमा निबन्ध लेख्नुपर्ने हुन्छ र निबन्धको निम्ति अङ्क 15 दिएको हुन्छ। 15 अङ्कको निम्ति निबन्ध लेखन दिइन्छ। यसरी नै खण्ड कमा नै पत्र रचना आउँछ, लेटर राइटिङ, जसको निम्ति पत्र रचनाको निम्ति 7 अङ्क दिएको हुन्छ र त्यसमा पनि सरकारी पत्र अथवा घरेलु पत्र, अफिसियल लेटर पनि हुनसक्छ, अनअफिसियल पनि हुनसक्छ, सरकारी अथवा घरेलु पत्र लेखनको निम्ति दिइन्छ, त्यसको निम्ति 7 अङ्क दिएको हुन्छ। त्यसपछि दिइन्छ कुनै एउटा अवतरण, अनसिन प्यासेज अथवा कम्प्रिहेन्सन भनेर हामी भन्छौँ, बोध दिएको हुन्छ, त्यहाँबाट प्रश्न सोधिन्छ 10 अङ्कको र 10 अङ्कको प्रश्न सोधिएको हुन्छ। 2 अङ्क गरेर जम्मा 5 वटा प्रश्न सोधिन्छ र त्यसको निम्ति 10 मार्क्स छुट्याइएको हुन्छ। र यसरी नै लिङ्ग परिवर्तन, वचन परिवर्तन, उखान, वाक्य निर्माण, अनुवाद गरेर विभिन्न प्रकारको शब्द भण्डारबाट 8 अङ्क गरेर 40 अङ्कको भाषा अथवा ग्रामर दिइन्छ अनि 40 अङ्कको चाहिँ साहित्य दिने गरिन्छ। र साहित्यमा हामीले हाम्रो विद्यालयहरूमा पढाउँदै गरेको भ्रमर उपन्यास अनि आइसिएससी साहित्य कुञ्ज, यो साहित्य कुञ्जभित्र, आइसिएससी साहित्य कुञ्जभित्र जम्मा 20 वटा पाठहरू रहेको छ। 20 वटा पाठमा 10 वटा कविता अनि 10 वटा कथाहरू हामी पढ्ने गर्छौँ। 10 वटा कविता पढ्नुपर्ने हुन्छ अनि 10 वटा कथा पढ्नुपर्ने हुन्छ र यो 10 वटा कथा र 10 वटा कवितामा 9 श्रेणी र 10औं श्रेणी गरेर 2 भागमा बाँडिन्छ र 9औं श्रेणीमा विशेष गरेर 5 वटा कथा अनि 5वटा कविता पढाइन्छ भने 10औं श्रेणीमा आएपछि 5वटा कथा अथवा 5वटा कविता पढाउने प्राय सम्पूर्ण विद्यालयहरूले यस्तो प्रकारको चाँजो मिलाएको हुन्छ। र आज म 10औं श्रेणीका विद्यार्थीहरूले पढ्नुपर्ने अथवा आइसिएससीको निम्ति तयारी गरिरहेका विद्यार्थीहरूको निम्ति एउटा कविता, बालकृष्ण समको एउटा कविता कर्म शीर्षक कविता पढाउन गइरहेको छु। र कर्म शीर्षक कविता पढ्नुभन्दा अगाडि हामी बालकृष्ण समलाई चिन्नुपर्ने हुन्छ, बालकृष्ण समको साहित्यिक परिचयलाई बुझ्नुपर्ने हुन्छ, बालकृष्ण समको कविता लेखनका विशेषताहरू बारेमा हामीले जान्नुपर्ने हुन्छ। जब हामी कुनै पनि कविता पढ्छौँ अथवा कुनै पनि कथा पढ्छौँ अथवा कुनै पनि उपन्यास पढ्छौँ अथवा कुनै पनि निबन्ध पढ्छौँ भने पहिला हामी लेखकको अथवा कविको विशेषतालाई, उनको लेखन शैलीलाई, उनको लेखनको विशेषतालाई अनि उनको जीवनीलाई अध्ययन गर्नुपर्ने हुन्छ। र जीवनी जब हामी बुझ्छौँ अथवा कवि अथवा कथाकारको विशेषतालाई हामी बुझ्छौँ तब मात्र हामी सहज तरिकाले कथालाई अथवा कवितालाई बुझ्न सक्छौँ। र बालकृष्ण सम शीर्षक, बालकृष्ण समद्वारा लिखित यो कविता कर्म शीर्षक कविता हामी पढ्न गइरहेका छौँ। र कर्मका कवि बालकृष्ण सम, जसको जन्म काठमाडौँको ज्ञानेश्वरमा भएको थियो, उनको जन्म 1901 सन् 1901 भएको थियो भने मृत्यु सन् 1981 भएको थियो। र काठमाडौँको ज्ञानेश्वरमा जन्मग्रहण गरेका बालकृष्ण समले 10 वर्षको उमेरमा नै आफ्नो पहिलो कविता प्रकाशित गरे। उनको पहिलो कविताको शीर्षक थियो ईश्वर। ईश्वर नामक कविता उनको पहिलो कविताको रूपमा त्यसबेला काठमाडौँबाट प्रकाशित हुने शारदा नामक पत्रिकामा प्रकाशित भएको थियो। शारदा पत्रिका त्यस ताकको खुबै चर्चित पत्रिका थियो। यो पत्रिकामा उनको पहिलो रचना ईश्वर नामक कविता प्रकाशित भएको थियो। र आफ्नो जीवन, आफ्नो लेखन यात्रा कविताबाट सुरु गरे तापनि उनलाई हामी नाट्य सम्राट भनेर चिन्छौँ। बालकृष्ण समलाई हामी नाट्य सम्राट भनेर चिन्छौँ। उनले सबभन्दा धेर चर्चा पाएको नै नाटकमा हो। र नाटक लेखनमा बालकृष्ण सम एक सिद्धहस्त र एक प्रसिद्ध नाटककारको रूपमा, एक सफल नाटककारको रूपमा हामी चिन्छौँ। र बालकृष्ण समले खुबै चर्चित नाटकहरू लेखेर नेपाली साहित्यको श्रीवृद्धिमा, नेपाली साहित्यको विकासमा अग्रणी भूमिका निर्वाह गरेको हामी पाउँछौँ। बालकृष्ण समका प्रकाशित कृतिहरूमा मेरो कविताको आराधना, मुटुको व्यथा, ध्रुव, मुकुन्द इन्दिरा, प्रहलाद, आगो र पानी, चिसो चुल्लो, प्रेमपिण्ड, अमरसिंह, मोह जस्ता चर्चित कृतिहरू छन्। यसमध्ये अधिकांशै उनले नाटक लेखेर नेपाली साहित्यको विकासमा ठुलो भूमिका निर्वाह गर्नुभएको छ, ठुलो योगदान पुर्याउनु भएको छ। र बालकृष्ण समको लेखनका विशेषताहरू बारेमा चर्चा गर्ने हो भने मानव प्रेम नै बालकृष्ण समको सबभन्दा प्रमुख विशेषता हो। मान्छेको जीवनसँग आधारित यथार्थवादी रचना लेख्ने क्रममा बालकृष्ण समलाई हामी एक प्रसिद्ध साहित्यकारको रूपमा पाउँछौँ। उनको कृतिहरूमा मानव प्रेमको दर्शनलाई उतारेको छन्। उनले एक दार्शनिक भएर एक बौद्धिक प्रखर व्यक्तित्वको रूपमा साहित्य सृजना गर्ने काम गरेको हामी पाउँछौँ। र बालकृष्ण समको विशेषताहरूलाई बुझ्दै हामी कर्म शीर्षक कवितातर्फ जानेछौँ। र कर्म कवितामा हाम्रो कर्मको अर्थ नै काम हो र हाम्रो कर्म चाहिँ जीवनमा कस्तो हुनुपर्छ भन्ने कुरालाई बालकृष्ण समले खुबै सरलतापूर्वक हाम्रो जीवन र हाम्रो दर्शनलाई व्यक्त गर्ने चेष्टा गरेका छन्। कर्म बालकृष्ण सम। कहिले मनमा आशा उदाउँछ, धेरै उत्साहित साधन पाइन्छन्, यस्तै साथी भेटिन्छन्, उज्यालोको सफेदी लाउन नसकिने कुनै अँध्यारो पट देखिन्न, हार्दिक बगैँचा प्रफुल्लित हुन्छ। यहाँनिर बालकृष्ण समले हाम्रो मनमा धेरै आशाहरू उदाउँछ, धेरै उत्साहित कुराहरू हामी पाउँछौँ, धेरै साधनहरू पाउँछौँ, हाम्रो जीवनमा धेरै उत्साहित हुने कुराहरू हामी प्राप्त गर्न सक्छौँ। हाम्रो त्यसबेला साथीहरू पनि धेरै राम्रो साथीहरू हामी पाउँछौँ। कुनै प्रकारको उज्यालोको रङ नलाउनु पर्ने एउटा अँध्यारोको पट भनेर भनिएको छ। पट भनेको अर्थ हो पर्दा। त्यस्तो अँध्यारोको पर्दा लाउनु नपर्ने एउटा स्थिति त्यहाँ देखा पर्छ अनि हाम्रो हृदयको बगैँचा पनि प्रफुल्लित हुन्छ, हामी आनन्दित हुन्छौँ, हामीलाई निराश हुनुपर्ने कुनै कारण देखा पर्दैन। कहिलेकाहीँ हाम्रो मनमा बादल उड्छ, कहिलेकाहीँ हाम्रो मनमा दुःख र वेदनाहरू पनि आउँछ। चारैतिर कालो बादलले ढाकिरहेको, कालो राक्षसहरूले हामीलाई घेरिरहेको, हामीलाई कुनै त्यो दानवी प्रवृत्तिहरूले हामीलाई घेरिरहेको जस्तो स्थिति सृजना हुन्छ अनि त्यति बेला चारैतिर निराशाको ढोकाहरू हामी देख्छौँ, सबैतिर ढोकाहरू बन्द भएको हामी पाउँछौँ, हामीले त्यहाँबाट निकास पाउँदैनौँ अनि कुनै सहारा पनि पाउँदैनौँ। त्यसताक हामी सहाराको हामी खोजी गर्छौँ तर हामीले कुनै प्रकारको सहारा पाउँदैनौँ। कतै कोही मिल्दैन, कतै कोही मिल्दैनन्। हामी सहाराको खोजी गर्छौँ तर त्यस बेला हामी केही पनि पाउन सक्दैनौँ। यस्तै हाम्रो जीवन यसरी नै चल्ने गर्छ, हाम्रो जीवन यसरी नै व्यतीत हुने गर्छ। घाम छायाको बिचमा भनेर कविले भनेका छन्, यस्तै घाम छायाको बिचमा बतासको बत्ती जस्तै लकपकाउँदै मधुरो हुँदै उक्साउँदै छटपटिँदै जीवन खर्च हुँदै जान्छ अनि एक दिन सिद्धिन्छ। यहाँनिर कविले हाम्रो जीवनको यथार्थलाई दर्शाउने चेष्टा गरेका छन्। जसरी घाम र छायाको बिचमा, उज्यालो र अँध्यारोको बिचमा हाम्रो जीवन चल्छ, यसरी नै त्यो बतासको बत्तीसँग हाम्रो जीवनलाई कवि बालकृष्ण समले तुलना गरेका छन्। बतासको बत्ती जसरी हावा चल्दाखेरि बत्ती घरि निम्न खोज्छ, घरि फेरि हावा नचलेको बेलामा त्यो बल्छ, राम्रोसँग बल्छ अनि घरि निम्ने चेष्टा गर्छ। त्यो बतासको बत्ती जस्तो हाम्रो जीवनमा पनि कहिले सुख आउँछ, कहिले दुःख आउँछ, कहिले आशा आउँछ, कहिले निराशा आउँछ, कहिले हामी हाँसिरहेका हुन्छौँ, हाम्रो जीवनमा हाँसो आउँछ, कहिले रोदन आउँछ। यो जीवनका पाटाहरू हो। दुःख सुख, हाँसो रोदन, मिलन बिछोड हाम्रो जीवनमा आइरहने घटनाक्रमहरू हुन्। र यहाँनिर कविले हाम्रो जीवन पनि घाम र छायाको बिचमा बतासको बत्ती जस्तै घरि लकपकाउँदै, घरि मधुरो हुन्छ, घरि फेरि राम्रोसँग बल्छ। यसरी नै हाम्रो जीवन खर्च हुँदै जान्छ, व्यतीत हुँदै जान्छ अनि एक दिन हाम्रो जीवन सकिन्छ भन्ने कुरालाई कर्म शीर्षक कवितामा व्यक्त गर्ने चेष्टा गरेका छन्। यस्तो छोटो अवधिमा पनि के हुन सक्छ र के गर्ने भन्ने पनि सुख दुःख भोग्दै निम्दै जाँदैछन्। अनि यो छोटो जीवनमा हामीले पाएको यो छोटो जीवनमा के गर्न सक्छौँ र हामी के पो हुन्छ होला र भनेर सोच्ने व्यक्तिहरू पनि यसरी सोच्दै एक दिन उनीहरूको निधन भएर गइरहेको छ। हामी निम्दै जाँदैछौँ भन्नुको अर्थ हाम्रो जीवन यसरी नै अन्त हुँदैछ। घरि हामी सुखमा जीवन व्यतीत गरिरहेका छौँ, घरि दुःखमा व्यतीत गरिरहेका छौँ, हाँसो रोदनमा हाम्रो जीवन व्यतीत भइरहेको छ। यस्ता विभिन्न कुराहरू गर्दै हाम्रो जीवन खर्च हुँदै जाँदैछ अनि यसरी नै हाम्रो जीवनको अन्त भइरहेको छ। अनि अवधि साह्रै छोटो हुनाले मरिमेटी केही गरौँ भन्ने पनि दुःख सुख भोग्दै उस्तै गतिले मर्दैछन्। जीवन छोटो छ, क्षणिक छ, क्षणभङ्गुर छ र यो क्षणभङ्गुर जीवनमा पनि केही गरिराख्नुपर्छ भन्ने सोच राख्ने व्यक्तिहरू पनि छन्। राम्रो कर्म गरिराखौँ भन्ने सोच राख्ने व्यक्तिहरू पनि हामी यो संसारमा पाउँछौँ। र यसरी यो छोटो अवधिमा दुःख र सुख भोग्दै जीवन बिताउने क्रम अघि गइरहेको छ, व्यतीत भइरहेको छ अनि यसरी नै हाम्रो जीवनको क्रम अघि बढिरहेको छ भन्ने कुरालाई कवि समले दर्शाउने चेष्टा गरेका छन्। उस्तै गतिले मर्दैछन् भनेको जो सोच्दैछ त्यो सोच अनुसार नै हामी राम्रो कर्म गरेर अथवा हामी नराम्रो कर्म गरेर आफ्नो जीवन हामी व्यतीत गरिरहेका छौँ। यस संसारमा आज हामी जे जति पाउँछौँ गरेर मर्नेहरूकै प्रेम कृतकार्य भई बाँचेको। कृतकार्य भन्नुको अर्थ राम्रो काम, राम्रो कर्म। आज हामी यो संसारमा जे जति पनि कुराहरू देख्छौँ, जे जति कुराहरू पनि अनुभव गर्छौँ, जे जति कुराहरू पनि हामी पाइरहेका छौँ त्यो एउटा राम्रो कामकै परिणाम हो। राम्रो कुरा नै हामी उपभोग गरिरहेका छौँ। हामी कुनै पनि साहित्यकारको कृति पढ्छौँ, कुनै पनि लेख रचनादि पढ्छौँ अथवा कुनै पनि पुस्तक पढ्छौँ, त्यो कृति कुनै एउटा व्यक्तिले लेखिदिएको कृति, कुनै व्यक्तिले लेखेको पुस्तक हामी अध्ययन गर्छौँ। त्यो कृतकार्य, त्यो राम्रो काम चाहिँ हाम्रो समाजमा बाँचिरहन्छ। हाम्रो मृत्युपछि पनि बाँचिरहने यदि एउटा कुनै चिज छ भने त्यो हो कृति अथवा कृत कार्य अथवा राम्रो काम चाहिँ हामीसँग बाँचिरहन्छ। यसैले कविले कर्म शीर्षक कविताको माध्यमबाट हामीलाई राम्रो काम गर्नतर्फ प्रेरित गरेका छन्, उत्साहित गरेका छन्। राम्रो कर्म गर्नुपर्छ, राम्रो काम गर्नुपर्छ। हामीले हाम्रो जीवन छोटो छ, यो छोटो अवधि छ, यो छोटो अवधिमा असल कार्यहरू हामीले गर्नुपर्छ भन्ने सन्देश यो कर्म शीर्षक कविताको माध्यमबाट बालकृष्ण समले दिएका छन्। र कर्म शीर्षक कविता एउटा सरल कविता छ। यो कविता मार्फत बालकृष्ण समले हाम्रो जीवन र दर्शनलाई व्यक्त गर्ने चेष्टा गरेका छन्। र यो कविताको माध्यमबाट समले हाम्रो कर्म असल हुनुपर्छ, राम्रो काम गर्नुपर्छ। जीवन छँदा नै हामीले राम्रो काम गरेर छोडिरहेको कर्म, राम्रो कर्म छोडेर गयौँ भनेदेखि त्यो चाहिँ समाजको हितको निम्ति हुन्छ, समाज उपयोगी हुन्छ, आउने सन्तानले पनि त्यसलाई अनुसरण गर्छ भन्ने कुरा व्यक्त गरेर राम्रो कार्य गर्नतर्फ हामीलाई अग्रसर गराएका छन्। अनि एउटा मानव प्रेमको भावना पनि यो कविताको माध्यमबाट व्यक्त गरेर समाजमा सधैँ हामी कृति छोड्ने किसिमको कार्य गर्नुपर्छ भन्ने सन्देश समले दिएका छन्। र आइसिएससीमा प्रश्नपत्र बनाउँदा अथवा प्रश्नपत्र दिँदा विशेष गरेर अवतरण दिइन्छ। कविताबाट कुनै एउटा अवतरण दिएको हुन्छ, त्यो अवतरणबाट एउटा उदाहरण निकालेर दिइन्छ अनि त्यसमा मुनिबाट प्रश्न गरिन्छ, जस्तो यो कविता कहाँबाट निकालिएको हो, यसका यो अवतरण कहाँबाट निकालिएको हो, यसका कवि को हुन्, यस कविताको माध्यमबाट अथवा यो पङ्क्तिको माध्यमबाट कविले के भन्न चाहेका छन्। जस्तो उदाहरणको निम्ति जस्तै घाम छायाका बिचमा बतासको बत्ती जस्तै लकपकाउँदै मधुरो हुँदै उक्साउँदै छटपटिँदै जीवन खर्च हुँदै जान्छ, एक दिन सिद्धिन्छ। यहाँनिर बतासको बत्तीसँग हाम्रो जीवनको तुलना कविले किन गरेका छन्? हाम्रो जीवन कसरी खर्च हुँदै जान्छ, अवधि साह्रै छोटो भन्नाले के बुझिन्छ, यो छोटो अवधिमा पनि हामीले के गर्नुपर्ने रहेछ, कृतकार्य भन्नाले के बुझिन्छ, यस्ता विभिन्न प्रकारको प्रश्नहरू सोधिएको हुन्छ। र विद्यार्थीहरूले विशेष गरेर यो कविताको भावलाई बुझेर, कविताले भन्न चाहेको कुरालाई बुझेर, कविताले जुन अर्थ अथवा कविताले जुन भाव व्यक्त गरेको छ त्यो कुरालाई मनन गरेर, चिन्तन गरेर, अध्ययन गरेर उत्तर तयारी गर्नुपर्ने हुन्छ। नेपाली हाम्रो मातृभाषा हो, हामी बोलिरहेका हुन्छौँ नेपाली भाषा, नेपाली भाषामै कुराकानी गरिरहेका हुन्छौँ, तर लेख्ने बेलामा हामीलाई नेपाली नै साह्रो लाग्छ, नेपाली विषय नै साह्रो लाग्छ भनेर हामी भनिरहेका हुन्छौँ। र विद्यार्थीहरूलाई म आग्रह गर्दछु, विशेष गरेर हामीले अध्ययन चाहिँ गर्न जरुरी छ। जति बेसी हामी पुस्तक पढ्छौँ अथवा कवितालाई दोहोऱ्याइ हामी पढ्छौँ, कविको परिचयहरूलाई, लेखकको परिचयहरूलाई दोहोऱ्याइ पढ्छौँ, त्यहाँबाट हामीलाई भाषा ज्ञान हुन्छ। हामी लेख्ने अभ्यास चाहिँ सबभन्दा धेर गर्नु जरुरी छ। विद्यार्थीहरूले जति बेसी लेख्ने अभ्यास गर्छन् त्यति धेरै नै शुद्ध लेख्न एउटा अभ्यास हुन्छ। र शुद्ध लेख्नको निम्ति पढ्ने अनि लेख्ने अभ्यासलाई नियमितता दिन जरुरी छ भन्ने आग्रह गर्दै यो लकडाउनको समयमा घरमै बसेका विद्यार्थीहरूलाई घरै बसेर यो अनलाइन शिक्षाको फाइदा लिने अनि यहाँबाट पढाइएका विषयहरूलाई खुबै गहनतापूर्वक पढेर तयारी गर्ने म आग्रह पनि गर्दछु। र भोलिको पाठ्यक्रम अन्तर्गत म भानुभक्त आचार्यको राम भरत संवाद नामक जुन कविता छ, यो कविता विद्यार्थीहरूलाई एकपल्ट पढेर घरमा बस्ने म आग्रह गर्दछु। र भोलि म अर्को विषय, अर्को कविता, हाम्रो पाठ्यक्रमको अर्को कविता आदिकवि भानुभक्त आचार्यद्वारा रचित राम भरत संवाद कविता पढाउनेछु।